get in, fellas. We're going back to therapy, a little less therapy today as we look to change the angle of our show. Nonetheless, it is Wednesday, March 12th. And guys, we're talking politics. I've been real serious on this show. You know, there's nothing political, there's nothing religious about being kind and gentle. My whole life, I've basically said, look, your local mayor, your state's governor are more important than the president as far as impacting your day-to-day life. And I don't really know that we can stick with that stance anymore, guys. I would like to be more educated on all these things that are happening. And I hope that we can today help our audience feel a little more educated at the end of this episode. I am not the person to educate you guys on all the policy that's been changing. And so I'm bringing on two fellow child mentalists and psychiatrists who should look familiar to loyal KGBs. My friend Bill Christie, who considers himself more of a political moderate, will be helping present a little bit of that side. And my friend Cashana, she does psych on your screen with us, who definitely is more liberal. And so we're going to be looking to kind of bridge that gap, talk about the policy changes that have come since the Trump inauguration, and to try to think, how would we as child and adolescent psychiatrists, how would we as kinder, gentler bros take all this sweeping change and make sense of it and see some of the pros and cons, even if we don't always agree with each other and everything that's happened so far. It's going to be a heavy episode. And so we're going to wrap bringing back something that old school KGBs will remember. We're going to do a breaking down the tape. Shane Gillis was on SNL a couple weeks ago and did a segment called Coupla Beers, which given we're going to talk about SSRIs and some of the thoughts on policy change around SSRIs. This is a parody of antidepressant commercials. So going to show that clip and then be able to talk a little bit about what SNL did right there with Shane and as they laugh about psychiatric medication commercials. So it should be a good episode, something different. I hope everybody feels like they learned something today and come out a little smarter. All right, let's go. All right, we are very lucky to welcome back a few good friends and fellow board-certified child and adolescent psychiatrists to join us on our policy discussion. Bill is currently the only board-certified child and adolescent psychiatrist who practices in the state of Wyoming. That's right. If we're thinking about access to resources and those kinds of things, that for years the joke was the state of Wyoming has none of the people who do what we do. And so we think Bill gives us a pretty cool, unique perspective, working in a more rural area, working in generally a more conservative area, and Bill kind of playing light into this today, referring to himself as politically moderate or more center, but in the world of child psychiatrists, that makes him alt-right, which is true, Bill. We appreciate your candor and your humor here because it is a very liberal, field. And then we have Cashana Betterly back. Cashana has been on our Psych on Your Screen segments. She is currently practicing in her hometown of Tampa, Florida. Cashana tending to be a little more liberal. So we're looking to have a few different kind of viewpoints as we look at the recent policy changes. Cashana at this time works for the Indian Health Services, which means she is a federal government employee. So Cashana is able to tell us firsthand about some of these new policies and initiatives that have impacted federal employees, as I hope everybody in our audience has been seeing. Why are we doing this today, guys? Cashana, as well as a few other people, politely and respectfully, have recently called me out, your host, of not being aware enough and honestly maybe being a little privileged in not keeping up with all the policy changes and being as aware of all these things changing over the last couple of months as they have been. As a result, what should we do in that situation? Rather than be offended, we should educate ourselves and make sure we're in a good position to be good citizens in this country. So our goal today, folks, is we are going to look at recent policy changes, talk a little bit about new Health and Human Services Director Robert Kennedy Jr. And look, and really want people to walk away today understanding how most government policy change can impact public health. And in my mind, that means anything related to public health, unemployment, recreation access, food security, education, climate change, healthcare, and civil rights can certainly impact people's mental health. Guys, thanks for joining us. How are we doing?
Doing great. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm doing pretty good. I just took a nap. So yeah, thanks for having me as well.
So Cashana, let's start with you. What I want Bill and Cashana to teach us as well is I'm somebody who's not consistently keeping up with politics and policy change. Cashana and Bill to follow, where do you get your information and how do you make sure you're getting good information?
It's a hard question to answer. Honestly, at least as far as how to be sure you're getting good information. My family is pretty conservative. I still have conservative friends. I also have friends who are very liberal. And so I think, first of all, just my social circle feeds me a lot of stuff. I get my news probably mostly from Breaking Points podcast, which I'll stand for. It's a great, I think, model for cordial disagreement on both sides. And it has more of an anti-establishment slant, which is on brand for me. I think I'm pretty skeptical, maybe cynical when it comes to government and politics in general. And so that kind of feeds me with a little bit of conspiracy theory here and there, and just generally a more critical approach to politics and policy in general.
And Cashana?
Yeah, so I use a website called Ground News. And so I really like Ground News because they split up, like for each news organization that reports on whatever topic, they basically tell you, does this news source have a leftist bias? Does it have a conservative bias? Or is it center? And it also denotes, is this of low factuality, mixed factuality, high versus very high factuality? So I'll really read any source, whether it's left, right, or center, just as long as it has high or very high factuality, and as long as it has a good reputation and it's been established for a long time. That's what I use. And it's kind of cool because they'll also show you, there's like a section on the website called Blind Spot, where they basically show you, what stories are mostly being covered by the left or mostly being covered by the right. So then you can kind of get a sense for, what sides of the aisles are reporting on what topics. I also hear news from other people when people text me about new developments. But yeah, that's the main source that I use.
Yeah, I've told Cashana that she's basically going to be my source of new information, as somehow my algorithm points away from this stuff, guys. I'm mostly cat videos and sports stuff. And so it's been helpful to have Cashana, as I'm close with, see a lot of that stuff from the federal government employee perspective, because not all doctors are being impacted by that stuff every day. There's not really a right place to start. I wonder about each of your maybe emotional reactions as RFK was named the Director of Health and Human Services. And from there, we'll talk about just some of the stuff that's gone on since. Cashana, what was your reaction when RFK was named to his role?
I'd say mixed to, lean towards negative. I was aware of some of his views, when he was running for president, and I had read about him during the confirmation hearing. He was either doing some flip-flopping, or was just kind of evasive in general when being asked about some of these previous views, which, if he still has them, could potentially be dangerous if he does chooses to act on any of these theories that he has. On some of these theories, not all of his theories are harmful, but there are some that I feel are, not factual, not really based in any kind of evidence, or it's maybe some sort of a half-truth. Ultimately, I'd say that I had mixed feelings, and I still have some concern about where things are going to go. At the same time, there are some topics that I'm glad he's really jumping into, like looking into the danger of microplastics. I think that's super interesting and very relevant. So it's a long-winded answer, but to answer your question, mixed to negative.
It's all good. Bill has long since been an RFK Jr. stan.
Yeah, Stan might be a little strong, but I did take a fondness to RFK. I think during primary season, or, it really would turn out to be the lack thereof for the Democrats. I thought that for a number of reasons, including just the whole MAHA approach. Obviously, we see a lot of people who are not healthy, and there's a lot of, I think, societal reasons for that, both psychological, but also a little more concrete, just in terms of toxic exposures, perverse incentives in the pharmaceutical industry, in big food, in big ag. And I think, as RFK was doing the rounds and trying to carve out a niche for himself, he was polling pretty well with Gen Z, millennials, Gen X, but really not with boomers. And a big reason for that was that the guy could not get an interview on big legacy media, maybe a little bit on Fox News once he started to swing right, or once it became clear that the Democrats were not going to give him a shot at Biden. Saw that, honestly, as like affirmation that perhaps he would be a decent choice, just given that, especially legacy media, depending on what you read, about half of their ad revenue, which makes up like 2/3 of their overall revenue, comes from a combination of big pharma, big food, and big ag. And that's billions and billions of dollars of incentive, to try to keep him from having a voice. I think given the rest of the board, he was a little more inspirational, a little less detestable, I guess, than...
Yeah. It's interesting, Kashana. I think I landed as I likely will today, somewhere in like the middle of these, where RFK has big goals and big dreams for what would make America healthy again with the MAHA movement. And to me, it all kind of misses the mark, where how can you talk about health without talking about education? And without talking about things like climate change and mental health, which he does it in kind of some ways and not others. But I do agree, Bill, on the surface, the way he wants to go about things and the things he'd like to change, they'd make sense. I think we'll see. So the first topic that really drew my attention and all three of our attention is recent discussions around SSRIs or antidepressants. So background, those are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, Commons or Prozac, Zoloft, Lexapro. And if you're listening to the show, you've likely heard of those. You're either on one, you know someone who is. Guys, open up. What has been currently actually put out there? I know Trump put an executive order out there lately. Who wants to educate us?
I don't think I actually watched that part of the confirmation hearing. I saw some other areas where he talks about various medications.
Yeah, just for some context, this is appropriately getting grilled by Tina Smith, who's a Democrat from Minnesota, and who, as the clip will show, has her own experiences on SSRIs about his comments. And I should say, going back to your first question, like, how do you know, if the news you're getting is legit? I try to hear it from the horse's mouth and watch like a long, unedited video clip that isn't editorialized, just to see, like, what actually is he saying. And very often I've found the comments for RFK or from anyone else are misconstrued. I'll do my best to share this. We can listen.
Mr. Kennedy, do you think that people who take antidepressants are dangerous?
I think, listen, I'm not going into HHS if I'm privileged to be confirmed with any.
So you can't say that people
to impose any preconceived ideas that I may have. I just want to have good science.
So you're not saying that they aren't dangerous, which means that they could be dangerous. Let me ask you this.
That's not true.
You've described Americans who take mental health medications as addicts who need to be sent to wellness farms to recover. Is that what you believe?
No, of course I didn't say that anybody should be compelled to do anything.
No, but you said they should be sent.
I said they should be available to them. I didn't say they should be sent.
You said that folks that take antidepressants are like addicts. That I can provide that.
Oh, I think they should have the availability. Listen, I know people, including members of my family, who've had a much worse time getting off of SSRIs than people have getting off of heroin. It's the withdrawal period is, and it's written on the label.
I have some experience with this myself, Mr. Kennedy. This is personal for me. When I was a young woman and I was struggling with depression, thankfully, I had the resources to help me get through it, including a new generation of SSRI uptake inhibitors, which helped to clear my mind, get me back on track to being a mom and a wife and a productive, happy person. And I'm really grateful for that therapy. So I have some experience with this, and I think that everyone should have access to that care. And your job as secretary is to expand access to care, not to spread lies and misinformation. And, the things that you say, Mr. Kennedy, they live on. They have impact. And, we're having this conversation at the same moment that my Republican colleagues are looking to try to figure out how to save money any way they can. And so they want to cut Medicaid. Let's just think about this for a minute, because you're going to be, should you be confirmed, you would be responsible for CMS, which provides mental and behavioral health care to millions of Americans. Close to 40% of folks on Medicaid have a behavioral health condition. And you would be part of this administration that would be looking to cut Medicaid. So, Mr. Kennedy, these statements that you've made linking antidepressants to school shootings, they reinforce the stigma that people who experience mental health every day face every single day. And I'm very concerned that this is another example of your record of sharing false and misleading information that actually really hurts people.
Senator, you're mischaracterizing my statements.
I am only putting into the record what you have said, Mr. Kennedy.
You're mischaracterizing my statements, and I'm happy that you had a good experience on SSRIs. Many Americans have very good experience on it. Others have not.
That would be an issue between them and their physicians, and not for the future head of HHS to be just putting out misinformation about the dangers of SSRIs and other antidepressant medication, spreading the stigma and the fear that we're actually trying to overcome.
Do you think physicians, when they make that prescription, ought to have access to good science?
Of course they do. And
That's all I believe too. And you and I are in agreement, Senator.
And to your point that you made when you made these statements, it was not based on good science. I don't know what it was based on.
I was saying the science needed to be done. I was saying these are potential culprits. We're coterminous, and I named other things. I said video games. I said social media. I said SSRIs. SSRIs have a black box warning of suicidal, homicidal behavior.
Mr. Chair, I will submit to the chair the information that I have about what Mr. Kennedy has said.
You know, it's interesting there. I think we caught a lot of what has, in my more superficial news that I watch, that the SSRIs are more addictive than heroin comment seemed to have caught a lot of fire. And guys, like, we prescribe these medicines. For most people, coming off of them is not fun, but it is also not inherently painful. I bet we all know patients who have really, really struggled after long-term use of SSRIs or SNRIs to wean themselves off. So I don't think on the surface, the comment, as shocking it is about being hard to get off heroin. It's not untrue for some.
I think around 15% of people experience discontinuation syndrome or withdrawal symptoms. So when we're thinking about withdrawal syndrome or withdrawal symptoms, it's not even like, obviously we let our patients know and we tell them this could possibly happen, but we also let them know that they might not have those symptoms and they might be able to taper off of this with no issue at all. And in his case, I do think that it's one of those situations of half-truths kind of leading into something that is, like she said, that could potentially bring about a lot of stigma, which, from a mental health standpoint, we've really been trying to break away. And I feel like, these past 10 to 15 years, we have seen the stigma regarding mental health treatment improve. But a statement like he made, I know he didn't specifically say, if you take an SSRI, you're at a higher chance of participating in a school shooting. He didn't do that, but he did voice an interest in looking at, is there any association? And, a lot of people out in the world who will see that, they won't be able to really understand the difference between causality versus correlation. There could be studies, I wasn't able to look into this too much, but in Sweden, and talking about the associations between violent crime and SSRIs. And then there was another one you posted that I think basically said that there isn't an association between school shootings and the antidepressants. So I think that it's just how we know people take in information. People who don't really have a firm understanding of biostatistics, they will see, somebody making a statement, school shootings did tend to increase around the time this medication was marketed. People are going to automatically jump to a causality conclusion. Maybe not everybody, but we can assume that at least some will. And that for those people, it'll probably have an impact on how they trust the mental health field in general.
So I appreciate RFK there saying, yes, it's not just SSRIs I'd like to investigate. It's social media, it's video games, other drugs. Yeah. And maybe how popular that quote around SSRIs became shows us, to your point, Bill, some of the bias in the media about this is something that can be really easily torn apart versus those other things. And I know there's been an executive order from Trump to have more research on SSRIs with teenagers. Why haven't we seen an executive order like that with social media? Why haven't we seen, because we know that data with mental health outcomes is purely bad. And we've seen it terribly over the last 20 years.
I mean, there might be one in there. There's like over 100 executive orders so far. So I don't know how you comb through all that stuff. I'm not going to pretend to know a small fraction of those. But I think, there are a few things there that I think are important to point out. I think one is, if you go on Reddit or social media, which I do, I wouldn't recommend it for people's mental health. So do as I say, not as I do. You would come away with the idea that RFK said that SSRIs are more addictive than heroin. Which of course is just a completely preposterous, ridiculous assertion. Like that's not true at all. That said, though, he said some people in his family have had a harder time getting off SSRIs than they have off of heroin, which may or may not be true. I don't know his family, but it's not completely implausible. I think, some people don't have a hard time at all getting off of heroin. We don't hear a lot about them. We don't see them, in the mental health world, clinically, but even in like train spotting, maybe there's the one guy like just can kind of stop, pick it up and put it down when he wants. And there's people that like go to work and do their jobs and use heroin and IV meth on the weekends. And like, that's a thing. There's also, a very small subset, at least according to the data, like on the order of like 1% to 2% of people that feel discontinuation symptoms or like withdrawal symptoms from SSRIs for months. And it's hard to say, I always wonder, is it that they're experiencing discontinuation symptoms? Is it that their symptoms of their depression are coming back and like the SSRI was actually working for them? But either way, they have a tough time. I think even the way we address it or the way we're taught to, address coming off of SSRIs, it's interesting semantics, right? We talk about like opioid withdrawal or benzo withdrawal. Even as we're like putting in the billing codes, that's the verbiage that's used. For SSRIs, it's SSRI discontinuation syndrome, not withdrawal. There's just little subtle, ways, aspects to the language that we're taught to use that I think indicate maybe a bias that we'd have, on our own part, especially, having seen tons of people get way better from SSRIs. There is one big population study from Sweden because they have socialized, single payer healthcare. Everyone's in a giant registry. It lends itself very well to do like sort of retrospective analyses of what's going on in the population at large. And so they looked at, is there an increase in convictions for violent crime for people that are taking SSRIs? And they find that there was a, what I would consider a moderately elevated hazard ratio, specifically for like younger adults, like up to 35. Folks older than 35 didn't seem to have any increased risk. But, of course, you can't determine a causal relationship from that, but there's a correlation there. And, it could just as easily go the other way. It's like, well, were they on SSRIs because they were having problems that predisposed them to violent crime convictions? So you can't really, you can't conclude a whole lot from that. I wouldn't say that there's science definitively in that direction. There's another study that's unfortunately is behind a paywall. So you have to like pay $12 to read it for 48 hours that, long story short, concluded that most school shooters have never been on a psychotropic medication. So from that, it's like really hard to say, that sure, SSRIs came out around the time that, Columbine happened, and that not a whole lot of conclusion to draw from that either. But I would say there's certainly not damning evidence that SSRIs are related to school shootings. There's hardly any evidence at all. And so as far as his goal of getting more evidence available to people like us who are prescribing these medicines constantly, who I would think care deeply about, violence in education settings and kids being killed, I would like to have that information, because I'm prescribing a fair number of these. I'm also taking a fair number of kids off of these when they're having big time problems, including increased aggression, including suicidal thoughts. I would love more information.
Cashana, you made a point about half-truths there and RFK kind of, especially when we talked about vaccines here in a minute, saying some things and then backing up a little bit. He, to me, really emphasizes what we're having in America, this difficult problem, mostly with men. RFK, Joe Rogan, Aaron Rodgers, to me, you're all in this camp of guys who consider themselves centrists. Bill, I like you smiling here, but you're one of these guys too. Which is like,
centrist.
What's the problem with asking questions? What's the problem with, posing these things? And I think we're seeing is that people with influence, Aaron Rodgers and the way he lied about not being vaccinated, RFK, Rogan, these guys have a lot of influence. And so when they just, hey, I'm just asking questions, they may very well just be asking questions, but we see that their audiences run faster with that. They take those questions they're asking and it means something. I ask you both, what is the role of politicians for watching what comes out of their mouth? Because they have influence and people in general are not going to interpret them as nuanced as they'd hope.
I think it's a good question. I think this is, a really good example of that. Even towards the end of that clip we just watched, he was saying that, the black box warning was issued for SSRIs for adolescents regarding suicide ideation and homicidal ideation. As far as I understand, I believe that black box warning is just for suicidal ideation, but it's just like little things like that. So now that is out there, it's on record. People can watch and rewatch that clip over and over again, and they're going to think now that the black box warning for teenagers with SSRIs is related to homicidal ideation as well. And there's nothing we can do to take that back. It's out. It's into the universe. People are going to do with that what they will. So to answer your question, yes, it's so important for politicians to be mindful of what they're saying and how they're saying it. As far as the solution to that, I honestly don't know. We're kind of in this era of, the non-status quo that is what the majority of the people voted for. So when I think about, your career politician who thinks about what they want to say and how they want to say it versus somebody who just kind of says what they feel and says what they think without much forethought, it's tough because on one hand, it's that trait that I think a lot of people are drawn to. And I think that's why a lot of the current people who have been recently elected to this cabinet have been elected. But then there's a dark side to that, and there's a negative side to that. And we're seeing that the negative side to that is the spreading of information that's just false. It's an issue.
Well, and let's apply the same standard to Tina Smith in this situation, or to just, the politicians that grilled RFK in his confirmation hearing. The way these things are set up, like everybody gets 5 minutes to try to get a soundbite that they can post to their TikTok, or that they can roll into a campaign ad, or otherwise score political capital, to move around within their party. In a way, even just the way this situation is set up, kind of has perverse incentives for the politicians that are participating in it. You don't score a lot of political points by saying like RFK says some things that aren't great, but there's some nuance there that maybe we should explore. That's not getting anyone riled up to go vote for you in the polls. Along the same lines, it's also not getting most people to click on your article. Whereas RFK takes aim at SSRIs, is going to incite a little bit of fear and some anger and get people riled up to click on, whatever article it is, or keep tuning in to Rachel Maddow or whoever, is on TV trying to capture those advertising dollars. It's a problem, I think, more broadly in politics in general, that more extreme statements, more polarizing views make the most money. And it's hard to get away from that in kind of a capitalist system that we have.
Just thinking so far about those things RFK said, what's actually happened, that, to think about mental health stuff directly based on his statements so far. Trump, early in office, rolled back protections on social media, so expanding free speech, while at the same time making social media more challenging and more of a problem for people as it's become. So not really much there. And again, I think that the difficulty into the stuff we've seen is RFK can say, yes, I would like people to be able to seek residential treatment. That's what he's saying when he talks about wellness farms. But also the Doge crew is rolling back NIH funding and rolling back funding for resources that could exist like that. I find it hard to believe at this point that even the way that RFK sees it and the way he would like America to be healthier is going to actually be implemented by this administration. Hope I'm wrong.
Yeah, there's a lot that's to be determined, and I think in the way, I don't know, Doge is like a whole separate issue. I think, Elon obviously is coming from the private world. He's got a history of using a chainsaw and dicing up companies and then causing problems and then fixing the problems as they pop up. That's cool. If Twitter's down for a couple of days, some people are going to have to direct their rage elsewhere. But it's not a huge deal, in the grand scheme of things. If the federal government can't function, well, now half of our patients are without an income. Naturally, I have pretty major concerns about the process. I think the idea is nice to try to get us more value for our tax dollars, but it seems very likely that things are going to get worse before they get better, if they get better.
Just sticking on RFK, something else that we as physicians have thoughts on. He's been very, very outspoken about vaccines this entire time. And I'll give my limited knowledge of this, which is, again, similar to the SSRIs. We'd love to have more information. He says sometimes, wouldn't we love to have the best information so that people can make their choices? While at other times, he's talked about linking vaccines to autism, that other negative aspects that have stuck in the news. Cashana, Bill, none of us lived in the polio era. None of us lived in rubella, measles, mumps as an outrage. So how has it felt? You ever see anybody with mumps, dude? Swollen nuts? It is not fun. I know I can say for sure that the decreasing trends of people getting vaccinated has been concerning. COVID made it worse. What are our thoughts on these last few years since vaccine hesitancy has taken hold in this country?
One really concerning thing that I saw back in 2021, RFK Jr. was doing a talk on the children's health defense with Dr. Judy Nikovitz, who I actually hadn't heard of until I started doing some research. And, they were talking about immunization schedules. And he was saying about how Black kids versus white kids, the immune responses are different. And he was talking about how Black people have a more robust immune response, saying that this could, change the way we roll out our vaccination schedules for Black kids, meaning maybe they have a less potent vaccine or a less potent version of it that would go with the Black kids. And then, everything would be kept the same for the white kids. And obviously, in my opinion, this is an incredibly dangerous suggestion as far as changing the vaccination schedules for kids based on race, meaning that there are some kids who could, be given not complete coverage, which means they could get super sick and then obviously pass on to other individuals. And I just think it could be chaos. Now, this was back in 2021. Maybe his view has changed in the past 4 years. I don't know. I don't believe it was brought up at the confirmation hearing. I'm not too sure. But this was something that I was pretty worried about. And I hope it doesn't really come to fruition, or that it doesn't actually lead to anything happening in terms of, policy change, or it's not going to be some new EO that pops up next week. So that is something that I'm concerned about. And just, his general stance, which more recently he has talked about in interviews, just, feeling that vaccines are not effective and that they're not safe. So it's kind of confusing because on one hand, he'll say that most vaccines, and I don't exactly remember how he worded it, but essentially on one hand, he seems to have this stance that vaccines are not safe, they're not necessary, they're unsafe, and they're not even effective. But then on the other hand, he's talking about, making different vaccination schedules for kids based on race. And I don't know. So those are my concerns that I have. And again, he's only been sworn in, let's see, I think he was sworn in on January 29th. So it's been about a month. I don't think there's really been enough time for him to make any suggestions on any actions he wants to take on this subject, but we'll see. We'll see what he ends up doing, if he ends up doing anything with vaccines at all.
I hadn't even heard about those comments until we were preparing for this, for this experience. So I went looking for receipts, where did that come from? I saw one study. It was that Black kids mounted a stronger immune response than white kids did for bacterial infection, which you can't really extrapolate, I don't think, to a viral situation or, to all illness in general. It's interesting, but I am surprised though that there's a lot of pushback against that kind of rhetoric, because I think there's one very legitimate criticism of medical research in general is that it's heavily skewed toward results from white people, that often Black people are excluded from trials, or at the very least, they're way, way underrepresented. And so, for these systemic, this is more an internal medicine pediatrics thing, which I'm, not an expert, so I'll play my position. But just that, these recommendations around statins or how to treat high blood pressure or high cholesterol are informed by data that's from white people, and that it might not actually pertain to Black people as much, or that they may suffer because they haven't been studied. At its surface, I think that the idea of well, maybe we should look into how Black people or any other minorities are differentially impacted by public health policy, it seems to me that that's a good thing. So I don't know.
What I think, and I wonder this a lot, I appreciate RFK and the wanting people to be able to make their own individual choices. What is the role in government? What is the role in public health when it comes to epidemiology, when it comes to public health and safety? I don't know. It's a good question. We've already seen that when we've given individual people the chance to vaccinate their kids or not vaccinate their kids, it's getting ugly out in the way that the world is today. We've seen this recent death of a kid with measles who was not vaccinated. Parents chose not to vaccinate them. And hopefully any audience member in our show understands the construct of herd immunity, which is for vaccines to be effective and for us to not have a recurrence of fucking polio. I don't know if people get to make their own choices. And I hate that I'm saying that, but it does beg the question of how free can we let people be to make their choices if it hurts the herd, if it's going to cause more trouble for the larger group than it would for the individual.
I think a lot of his criticism or his qualms about vaccines in general are around some of the perverse incentives involving the business of vaccines and the process by which they're developed and then distributed, most often before there's any sort of placebo-controlled trial relating to the safety of the vaccine. Now, I think there are practical reasons for that, especially in a situation like COVID, where you don't really have time. There's a pandemic that's happening right now. You don't really have time to get long-term safety data, because by the time you get it, the pandemic's over and you've developed herd immunity through natural means. And I pulled kind of the direct clip from his Lex Friedman podcast in 2023 that that a lot of people reference when they attack him for his anti-vax stance.
Talked about that the media slanders you by calling you an anti-vaxxer. And you've said that you're not anti-vaccine, you're pro-safe vaccine. Difficult question. Can you name any vaccines that you think are good?
I think some of the live virus vaccines are probably averting more problems than they're causing. There's no vaccine that is, safe and effective.
Those are big words. What about the polio? Can we talk about the?
Well, here's the problem.
Yes.
Here's the problem. The polio vaccine contained a virus called simian virus 40, SV40. It's one of the most carcinogenic materials that is known to man. In fact, it's used now by scientists around the world to induce tumors in rats and guinea pigs in labs. But it was in that vaccine. 98 million people who got that vaccine in my generation got it. And now you've had this explosion of soft tissue cancers in our generation that kill many, 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 many more people than polio ever did. So if you say to me that the polio vaccine was effective against polio, I'm going to say yes. If you say to me, did it kill more people? Did it cause more deaths than avert? I would say, I don't know, because we don't have the data on that. So
I think what he's saying is that there's not sufficient data for you to declare these vaccines necessarily safe. I think effective, it's hard to argue with that. I don't know. I can't throw a lot of weight behind, clearly the vaccines are effective. You'd have to be, pretty delusional or in outer space, that they're not effective. Otherwise we'd have polio and measles and mumps and diseases that even through training, like none of us really have ever seen in this country. Like you'd have to go do some mission work really to see that stuff in this day and age. I think we all agree on that. The safety though, I think is really the bigger point of contention. And I think he's got a point. I mean, my takeaway, relative to what I would read, secondarily in the media or like from editorialized articles or, podcasts, whatever, is that he's very anti-vax. Whereas in reality, his position seems pretty nuanced. I pulled that study and looked through it, and anyone can see it. This guy's last name, AABY et al., 2018, evidence of increase in mortality after the introduction of diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis vaccine to children aged 6 to 35 months in Guinea-Bissau, a time for reflection, ? And sure enough, even though vaccinated population had a significantly larger, weight for age, which you would think would give them an edge as far as like morbidity, mortality, very clearly, especially for girls, like he said, increased all-cause mortality if they got the vaccines. We should know why that is, and again, this isn't for me to figure out. This is not my area of expertise, so I'll play my position. But, he's got receipts. Like there is evidence, and this is science. This is trust the science. This is the data suggesting that for some reason, maybe it has nothing to do with the vaccine, but it probably should be explored a little bit more. Grant, we're not giving this vaccine out now, but if that's the case, and it took until 2018 to figure that out after decades of that vaccine being used, what might we be missing, in the vaccines that that we're putting out right now?
Says vaccines cannot be safe; they're inherently unsafe. He means that they're going to have side effects. He means is that? That's because it's like you use unsafe and that sounds one way to your audience base. And if you say there's going to be pros and cons, we want to make sure the pros outweigh the cons. And that to me is a different way of saying that than the way he so vehemently will say things like there are no safe vaccines. So I think that's just dangerous language.
Lex cut him off, I think. So maybe he would have explained that a little bit more. I don't know. But I agree. Yeah. I mean, word choice isn't the best. I don't know. What do you think, Cashana?
I actually did jot that down, because I felt like there were times he would contradict himself. And so, so I have him, saying there are no vaccines that are safe and effective. And then at one point, Lex says, wait, so you don't think that there's at least one that could be effective? And then he responds with, well, a lot of them are effective. And then he goes on to talk. So there's that discrepancy. But then also my thing is like, okay, I definitely hear what he's saying as far as making sure that, as far as trials being done before administering these vaccines, trials for safety versus trials for efficacy. Like, yeah, it sounds like that's what he's saying. It sounds like he's wanting to make sure that for any new vaccine that we put on the market, that we're doing safety trials and not just looking at efficacy as well. That being said, it sounds like he's not really satisfied with maybe the way the research is being done now. I guess that's the question is, one, is he extrapolating what happened here with the DTP vaccine onto other potential vaccines in the future? And is that maybe kind of like driving some of the bias here? Just in terms of, like we know he had that company, that conversation with Bernie Sanders. We know that he used to own a company that would sell anti-vax merchandise to families and mothers and things like that. So
Onesies for babies.
Onesies for babies.
Right.
So I guess my question is like, for somebody who's filled with so many contradictions and who says so many things that are not really constant, for me, it's difficult to support somebody who, is going back and forth on this issue here. And now I think he's trying to not be transparent. And also, the fact is he wants to make these changes and do all these things, whereas from a budget standpoint, we've got freezes on different types of medical research. And so how are we going to be able to look into these things that he wants to look into with limited resources?
What a smooth transition, Cashana, because I want to make sure we got to thinking about some of the DOJ Department of Government Efficiency budget cuts and things that have changed over the last 6 weeks or so. And Cashana, you're going to be our, one of our main sources, experiencing them yourself working in the government. And I wonder that same thing too, Cashana. You want to talk about SSRIs and studying SSRIs. We could pull a bunch of data. I'm sure that the tech is good enough. The question is, without the money, how are we going to make the lives of people less depressing so that they do not need antidepressant medications, right? Who's going to be studying that stuff without NIH funding? We're pulling money for national parks. Hey, if you want people to get outside, RFK, and you want people to use exercise and sunshine and vitamin D and all these things he's referred to, are you going to fight for resources that expand just right outside Health and Human Services? Because again, public parks, public education, food security, all these things are going to be relevant. Having sat in a government office and working for the federal government, what are some of the changes you've seen firsthand thus far that have impacted your work?
Well, for starters, my return to office date is April 28th. So I am a remote worker. I work from home here in Tampa, Florida, but as far as where my patients are located, they're at various clinics across the western coast of the United States. So I see people in Colorado, I see people in New Mexico, I see people in Arizona, and then I also have some clinics. Well, I have a clinic that's going to be starting up soon in Virginia, and then I have a couple clinics where I see patients out in South Dakota. I don't technically have an office, and so what we've had to do, and other providers in the Telebehavioral Health Center for Excellence program, and so a lot of us, we work from home, our offices are at home, and so what I've had to do is I actually had to go and look for a government-affiliated building, whether it's with the FDA, it could really just be any government-affiliated building. And it looks like there is one near my house. It's like 2.2 miles away. And I sent that to my supervisor, and he can't give me any information on if this office will work, if it counts. Because of that, he's also asked if I'd be willing to just move to Maryland, which, yeah, I'm not 100% against. I lived there for 2 years. I really liked Silver Spring. But, I think it's just the fact that, what is this all predicated upon? This whole movement is happening because Musk has this idea that individuals working from home, that they're lazy and that it's wasteful and that, we need to keep tabs on people working from home so that taxpayer dollars and going to people who are just being lazy and wanting to lay around. It's frustrating because my job is super busy. I have around 6 or 7 clinics in total. Are there people who work remotely or do telehealth who maybe they take a little bit longer for lunch? Sure, probably. But from a cost benefit standpoint, and obviously we'll have to see because I don't know and I can't predict the future, or I guess the potential financial drawbacks for people now having to drive into the office, that compared to, how much waste they eliminate by having them work at an office where eyes are on them versus working at home. I don't know.
Cashana, you make a really, Cashana, the big point for you is you work remotely so that you were able to see Native American patients all over the country who, that is an underserved population. Telehealth has been instrumental in making sure that they have some of the resources that they have. And my question is, if you're going to have, policy change that has physicians or other caretakers leave their roles, what's the reciprocal move, right? Is there going to be a move that funds money into those underserved populations? Is there going to be a reciprocal move that makes working for the federal government, more appetizing? I haven't heard anything about public service loan forgiveness going by the wayside, but boy, oh boy, would that fuck the number of young physicians and healthcare workers who are willing to work for the government and willing to work in lower paying jobs. And so, Cashana, even to your point, not allowing people to work from home is going to make those less appetizing jobs even less appetizing.
I mean, it's definitely a job that I like, and it's not an easy job. That being said, it is rewarding, and it is really awesome being able to work with patients who are in so many different parts of the country. So that has been cool. I'll say RFK Jr. has spoken in support of Indian Health Services, which I was very surprised to see. Pleasantly surprised, of course, but how he's wanting to make all these changes to IHS with all these budget cuts, I don't know. I think it's going to make his job harder. And I think I read, and correct me if I'm wrong, something like $880 billion in cuts, I think, over a 10-year period from Medicaid. I think that's what I read. I'd have to take another look at it. But, and the random Sunday or Saturday emails from Musk saying, hey, what'd you do last week? We got another one yesterday. Those are, I personally didn't care. All right, that's fine. I'll send that to you. But I didn't know it was going to be something on a weekly basis, because otherwise I'm just going to copy and paste the same thing. So what I did last week is what I did this most recent week is what I'm going to do the following week. I mean, really not much difference. So again, I'm not quite sure if this is a move to try to intimidate people. I still think that, like with the fork in the road email and by offering for people to leave voluntarily, with I think up to 6 months in pay or something, I think up until September, they didn't get as many people to take that offer as what they were wanting to. So now I wonder, are they trying to utilize other methods to get people to want to leave, i.e. return to office, so making your job less convenient and less enjoyable, and now making our jobs less convenient and enjoyable by having to respond to these emails that I think are they're annoying at best and, potentially threatening, and it could put people off at worst.
Bill, what are your thoughts, on the overall concept of the Doge crew? Like, why and what's the hope?
But I think Doge or the support, which I might be waning at this point for Doge, at least in terms of people getting into the ballot boxes, was just that we're spending all this money, and if there's $880 billion to cut over the next 10 years, like presumably we're spending way, way more than that. But where are our results? We have our children and our adults are some of the fattest in the world. We're underperforming academically. We're sick. We're mentally ill. And so the money that we're spending isn't working, on some level. I'm not going to pretend to know, all the reasons for why that is, but I think that's the general energy that's behind it. Again, I think the idea is one that I can get behind. The process, like maybe not so much. I would prefer there be orders of magnitude more thought put into what's getting cut and when it's getting cut and how it's getting cut so that people don't get hurt in the course of things getting cut. Again, it's not, the federal government is not Twitter. Like, shit matters to real people who we see all the time. But that said, the system we have right now is not working, just objectively. And it's especially not working for people like Cashana sees and a huge portion of the folks that I see who are just extremely underserved, who are minorities and who are by and large like kind of forgotten by the system at large, and and who are very legitimately victims of of generations of just despicable mistreatment.
I think it'll be interesting to see what happens over time, right? As the federal government looks to be harder and less involved, some more and some less involved in various things that to me all relate to each other. If the federal government's going to go hands off on education, as we've already seen them do, to look to disband the Department of Education, put more on the states, to me, that all directly correlates to the public's mental well-being and health. Physical, mental health is the role in schools, thinking about the future. There's funding being cut to Head Start programs, to access to speech and occupational therapy services before school. So that stuff's happening nationwide too. And so it's pretty concerning like you said, Bill, the government wants to spend less money, and what will happen if and when the population struggles because of this, and I think it'll be interesting to see. Bill, we were just talking about something interesting yesterday in our social time, and audience, we couldn't possibly cover every topic here. We made a big giant list, and for time's sake, we're going to try to limit something. But one of the most interesting things that I wonder, is it just to be racist? Is it just to be homophobic or transphobic? Banning, trans folks from serving in the military? Are we that flush with military recruits that we're cool turning people down? And I don't have any numbers, but we were just thinking about that yesterday, Bill. Like, okay, are that many people signing up to serve in the military that we can say no to some of them?
It seems
Good
crazy
question.
at its face, honestly. And I think we have to pause and just point out the irony, especially, as the federal government is saying, like, oh, you're trying to limit access to HRT. For kids, I think it's a different issue. That's a whole different debate. But, RFK is taking gender affirming hormones. The guy's like juiced out of his mind. And so to be doing that, but then say that other people, especially people who have gone to war, or at least making comments to that effect, they potentially lose that service is preposterous. Now, I know that right now, at least through the VA, there hasn't been any disruption to HRT for veterans. They're still getting trans affirming care. I sincerely hope that continues to be the case. I think there's a measure of kind of inflated anxiety because of just media coverage of this issue that happens to be, pretty partisan. And again, it's like trying to get people upset so they click on stuff and generate ad revenue. Yeah. What I read, if I do read on the subject, is that, our population of young people is too overweight, too mentally ill, and using too much drugs and alcohol to qualify for military service. So it seems like cutting a significant population out of the opportunity to serve their country, and in so doing gain access to certain career training or education, that sort of stuff. It just seems extremely short-sighted to me, especially given the international climate.
Funny, you talked about RFK clearly being on steroids, but like Elon Musk has hair plugs. He has, he has had cosmetic surgery to change the shape of his face. Like, all of that is considered gender affirming care. He may have the pockets to pay for that stuff, and so it could become just a haves and have-nots kind of issue. But guys, as the primaries for the 2024 election and the debates were happening, my biggest takeaway watching those debates was there was zero mentions of mental health at large and zero mentions of climate change, which you can bitch and moan if you want is the number one issue that is pressing the world as it stands, right? We're going to be fucked if we don't make these changes sooner than later. Mental health wise, we know this. We are 3-child shrinks here, guys, listening, and that on this trajectory, as Bill just said, this upcoming generation is going to be too depressed and too anxious to function in the workforce. So what I'm hoping is that if Trump and the homies, Elon, RFK, really do think they want to be efficient, they're going to need a workforce in order to make that happen. And so the only thing I can hope is that society is fucking up hard enough that we realize that we've got to look at prevention. We have to go back younger. We have to take care of children. We have to take care of schools, because economically, it's not going to suit us if our population can't work. It's going to get ugly out there. So fingers crossed tight, y'all. What takeaways do you have for our audience, guys?
Yeah, I'm worried about Gen Alpha, with their skibbity toilets and Ohio references. Yeah, I'm worried about Gen
Ohio,
Alpha.
especially.
I guess my takeaway here is, I'm trying to keep an open mind. I'm trying to stay more optimistic because I can be pretty cynical. And so I'm hoping that, I just hope that there's less harm than good. That's all I can do for this administration. I just hope for overall net gain. I hope for overall net positive. I hope that there aren't too many lives that are ruined. So far, there have been tens of thousands of people who have been laid off from various segments of the federal government workforce. And and as far as RFK Jr.'s, his plans, we're just going to have to wait and see. We know at the very least what his interests are, and he is a little bit vague, I think, when it comes to how he's going to tackle some of these issues in the future, compared to being much more transparent during what he wants to do during past interviews he's had. So that being said, I hope he looks into microplastics. I hope he's able to make America healthy again. And I hope that there isn't a lot of harm that comes from that. Ultimately, I really would like to see him stand firm on what he believes and not flip-flop, because I have a sense that, if he were to be truly open and honest, I think, he would maybe ruffle feathers with other people in the cabinet. And I do wonder how much he's really going to be allowed to do just from a budgetary standpoint. So we'll see.
Again, the system we have hasn't been working. And while I acknowledge that there's quite a bit of bathwater to RFK's baby, also I would prefer the pendulum start swinging his direction as opposed to continue to swing in the direction it's been swinging. It's produced a lot of major systemic problems for kids, especially. And while I think his personal life will probably preclude him from the Bro Motions Hall of Fame, I am optimistic that in 10 years' time, we may look back on this time period in this administration and say, yeah, while it was a pretty rough process, it did produce some lasting positive changes from a public health standpoint. In the meantime, I think it's up to each of us to try to push back on our own cognitive distortions around what's going on, in particular, minimizing, maximizing, catastrophizing, fortune telling, black and white thinking. I think all of those things are leveraged very heavily by the media to get you upset and to get your attention and keep your attention. And in the case of big social media companies, to drive engagement and online discourse, with their platforms. I would just say, try to push back on that stuff. I think one good way to do it is with more information. And I think, we live in a time where the information is out there and is available. So rather than just listening to what people are saying about what's going on and taking their word for it, go hear from the horse's mouth. You can go onto the White House's website and look at all those press briefings. You can, like we've done, just look at these discussions, in context, without editorialization and without people doing their best to get you really upset about it.
Well, thank you guys for your time. And as we do on this show, let's acknowledge that we all had some different opinions here. We're able to talk about things, be kind to one another with an overall goal, as we'd ask, which is, let's not always think about how these policies only impact us or impact our group of people, but the larger whole of society. And like we said, hopefully some of these ideas that on the surface seem helpful can really be enacted in that way and make us have a more mentally and physically healthy populations. Y'all, I will see y'all around soon, and we'll be back right after this, guys. We're going to lighten the tone at the end of the episode and share a really funny clip from SNL last week where Shane Gillis talks about Coupla Beers serving as his antidepressant. We'll wrap this week by lightening things up and doing a breaking down the taste of Shane Gillis's recent SNL performance and a segment they did specifically called Coupla Beers. This is meant to parody medication commercials and psychiatric medication commercials. It's funny. We're laughing. We're not agreeing that alcohol is the way to solve your problems, or that cocaine is the reason to help with drowsiness from alcohol. But I do think this is a really well done sketch. Some good stuff buried in the obvious nod to not abusing substances to help our emotions. But Shane Gillis does a great job there, kind of showing what would men want to be working on that substances may allow them to do better, which is, communicating better with our loved ones. So being kinder to our partners, to our children, showing up best at work. And so I think it really proved that point, as there is a question about how can people maybe exist in this world without antidepressant medications, as we see some legislation wondering the pros and cons of those, is that, hey, people are going to have these problems no matter what. And we need to be arming men with the ability to communicate effectively and show up in this world how we'd like them to, with or without medication. Notice that they ended up having an intervention for Shane there at the end. So we shout out our addiction block. And if you're interested in looking about how interventions are really done, you can go back and check that episode. So guys, great episode this week. I'll dive right into the sources and takeaways. So Bill and Cashana specifically talked about the kinds of sources they like to use. But overall, just make sure you're, checking your political sources when you're learning about current events out in this world, and make sure you're getting a fair way of thinking about these things. And as always, guys, be kinder and gentler out in this world. Communicate with each other, because inevitably any solutions to the way the world is right now are going to require all of us. And so we're going to have to learn other people's perspectives so that we can make sure we know how to get everybody involved. All right. So be kinder and gentler this week with that in mind. And we'll see y'all next week to get back to the neurodiversity block.